the different dimensions of hunger and food waste. We're joined by Jack Bobo. He is the Director of Global Food and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. Thanks very much. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
You know, there's so much to talk about. I want to get to the conflict, the grain, those issues, but let's talk about some of the expectations for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. 8 years ago, the UN really pushed for and passed a measure for a dramatic reduction in the amount of food wasted each year. The sad truth is that lofty goal is not even close to being met. And some nations, such as the US, New Zealand, and Australia, I believe, the situation has gotten worse. Okay, put things in perspective for us, and just how bad is this?
Well, you know, it's a really large problem, and it's a large problem in a number of ways. I mean, it's a problem because there are over 800 million people that are going to bed hungry, and if we're losing 30 or 40% of our food, you know, that's a huge tragedy. But it's also a tragedy because of the global emissions and greenhouse gases that come from all of that food that's being produced and then just wasted and going into landfills. And so it causes problems in many different ways.
Now, let's take the U.S. for example. The average person in the United States is wasting some 700 calories a day of food. Now, think about how far that would go in a developing nation, and it would take very little, it seems, to improve on that.
Yeah, well, it seems that way, but food waste is not one problem. It's hundreds and hundreds of problems because the way food is wasted, if it's beef or meat versus how it's wasted if it's fruit and vegetables, is just different. And much of that waste is happening post-consumer. So, of course, you can't really collect the food that people didn't eat or people threw in the trash can and make that available to others. And so food that is wasted prior to the consumer, there is the opportunity to make that available in other ways, but not the post-consumer waste.
Okay, I want to pick up on that because it's like you can read my questions. That's where I was going next. Because it's not just the wealthy nations, meaning more and more have a lot of room to grow. But let's talk about ways that countries can keep that food from being tossed in the dump and instead end up in a safe and healthy way to those people who really need it.
Yeah, so there are a few different things that can happen. In 2016, France passed a law that basically made it illegal for retailers to throw away perfectly good food from the grocery stores. And so that was food that was reaching the end of its shelf life in terms of the best buy dates, but was still safe to eat. And so they wanted to ensure that that food made its way to people that could use it. And so they basically told companies, grocery stores, if you throw it away, we will find you and we will fine you. And that's had a big impact on making sure that that food does reach people in need.
Do you have any statistics on that? I mean, just to kind of, even in broad strokes, to give us an idea on how much that has changed, because that's seemingly the exact kind of thing that Australia, the US, and others could really benefit from if they were able to hold the feet to the fire and make people follow through on what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for that, but one of the limitations is that grocery store waste, unfortunately, retail waste is only about 6% of that problem. And so while it's an enormous problem in the scheme of things, it's an easier problem to try to address. Grocery stores or restaurants during the years of COVID gained some flexibility to make food available to food banks and others at the end of the day. And so some laws have been clarified in some communities to just make it easier and safer and less sort of legal hazard of making that food available. And so we've seen a large uptick in that. And many events, you know, at the end of the day, whether it's a wedding or a business meeting, now there are programs where you can actually have somebody come and pick up that food at the end of the day and make it available. So there are definitely efforts that are happening, but you know, as you said, the problem yet is still getting worse despite these new initiatives.
Jack, let's talk about food waste and what it is doing to the environment, because I think a lot of people may not realize that when all this food ends up in landfills and then begins to decay, methane is released, one of the harmful gases that leads to climate change. Walk our viewers through that process and why we should be concerned about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised that agriculture's direct emissions are 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions, but agriculture is also responsible for about 80% of deforestation as it expands land. So that means agriculture is really responsible for about 25 to 30% of all emissions. And that's an enormous number. And if a third of that is food that doesn't need to be thrown away and that people are desperate to have, then that presents this huge opportunity as well. We can help to feed the 800 plus million people that are going to bed every night hungry, and we can have a dramatic decrease in the emissions that are leading to climate change and biodiversity loss.
You know, in the U.S., as I understand it, only 5 states have approved new laws, new measures to keep food out of landfills. And even those 5 states, most of those measures, as I understand it, are considered kind of toothless. And the fact that the U.S. is getting worse at this, what is it going to take for the United States to really focus on this, if you will, and understand that people are going hungry because people are wasting food, it's threatening the environment, and it's just a waste of money?
Yeah, that ReFed report, pointed out that about 91 million tons of food is wasted every year in the United States. So that's just an enormous number. And one of the things that's happened in central Ohio, they've been looking at how can they reduce that waste. And so they have been focusing on messaging to consumers, and it's not focused on the environmental impact that one might expect. Really, they're focusing on the bottom line. It's like, if you're throwing away $1,200 every year in food that you're not consuming, and so trying to help them understand, one, the impact on their own wallet, and then the steps that they can take in their own household to avoid that loss. And that seems to be making more of a difference than sort of this general, it's a bad thing to do.
Yeah. Jack, we've been so negative about all this, with the threat to the environment, and with the conflict continuing on between Ukraine and Russia, threatening the breadbasket that feeds so much of Europe and other areas. Is there something you can point to that is positive right now?
Yeah, I think that these initiatives that are happening in Ohio, Washington, D.C., Boston are showing, one, that there's an increased awareness of this problem, and two, that there are a lot of consumers that want to be a part of these programs. They're hoping to scale to 30,000 households in Boston. And so I do think that if you make programs available, if you make it easy and you help people to understand why they need to do it, why it's in their own best interest, people will take advantage of these opportunities.
Well, wonderful. Continue to get that news out there, and we look forward to chatting with you again. Thanks very much for your insight.
Thank you.